Opening scene, imagine a war-torn Pacific island. The air smells of gunpowder and death. The ground is soaked with rain, sweat, and blood. Japanese soldiers crouch in their foxholes, listening to the thunder of naval artillery pounding their once invisible defenses. Then, through the smoke and chaos, they hear a sound that makes their hearts sink. The deep, guttural shouts of American Marines charging forward. The Japanese Imperial Army had fought many enemies. Chinese troops in Manchuria, British soldiers in Burma, and the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol. But none struck fear into their hearts quite like the United States Marine Corps. This wasn't propaganda. This was a sentiment whispered through trenches, spread across bunkers, and recorded in diaries that somehow survived the war. Japanese soldiers didn't just respect the Marines. They hated fighting them, because every battle against them was a nightmare that refused to end. But why? What made these American fighters so different from the rest? To understand this, we need to step back to the 1940s, into a war that stretched across the Pacific, one fought not just with bullets, but with ideology, pride, and sheer human endurance. The Pacific theater was a place unlike Europe. There were no rolling plains or grand cities to conquer, only islands, jungles, volcanic ridges, and coral reefs. Every piece of land had to be taken inch by inch. The Japanese called it Jigoku no Shima, the island of hell. And the Marines, they called it their job. From Guadalcanal to Peleliu, Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the Marines faced some of the most brutal combat in modern history. But what made them particularly terrifying to the Japanese wasn't just their weapons or their numbers. It was their attitude, their unrelenting will to keep coming, no matter how many fell. Japanese soldiers were trained to believe they were the ultimate warriors, blessed by divine spirit, unmatched in courage or discipline. The Bushido Code taught them that surrender was shameful, and death in battle was the highest honor. They believed Western soldiers, especially Americans, were soft, spoiled by comfort, unaccustomed to hardship. But when they met the U.S. Marines, that illusion shattered instantly. At Guadalcanal, the first major ground offensive against Japan, the Marines were outnumbered, undersupplied, and isolated. The Japanese expected them to break. But the Marines didn't. For 6 long months, they held their lines against relentless night attacks, artillery barrages, and starvation. The Japanese learned something they weren't prepared to face. The Marines could match their fanaticism blow for blow. When Japanese soldiers crept through the jungle at night, they expected to find sleeping Americans. Instead, they met Marines waiting in the dark, knives in hand, eyes wide open. The Marines fought like predators, patient and cold. They didn't just defend, they hunted. Japanese officers wrote in horror that American Marines were demons who do not fear death. The Marines also fought differently. Where Japanese troops relied on banzai charges and rigid obedience, the Marines adapted, improvised, and used teamwork. Every Marine was trained to be a rifleman first. It didn't matter if you were a cook or a radio operator. That philosophy created a terrifying efficiency in battle. Even if a Marine squad lost its leader, another would instantly take over. The machine never stopped, but perhaps the greatest weapon the Marines had was their unity. On those islands, survival depended on trust. Marines shared water, rations, cigarettes, and even letters from home. They were brothers. And that bond gave them a kind of ferocity that the Japanese had underestimated. Now, imagine you're a Japanese soldier trapped in a bunker on Peleliu. You've been awake for 72 hours. The heat is unbearable. You're low on food and your comrades are dying one by one. The shelling never stops. And then you hear the distinct crack of M1 rifles, followed by the sound of boots moving closer. Methodical, unstoppable. You peek out and see Marines advancing through fire and smoke, faces blackened with dust, moving with terrifying calm. You realize they're not stopping. That's when fear turns into hate. Because deep down, you know you can't win. It wasn't just battlefield courage that made Marines so hated. It was how they turned the Japanese tactics back on themselves. The Marines learned to use flamethrowers and demolitions to root out cave defenses, to call in naval gunfire with surgical precision, to coordinate air, sea, and ground like a single organism. Every island campaign made them sharper, harder, and more ruthless. By the time of Iwo Jima, the Japanese commanders themselves called the Marines the most dangerous enemy on Earth. For the Japanese, losing to the Marines wasn't just military defeat, it was spiritual humiliation. The Bushido Code promised that courage and devotion would triumph over everything. But the Marines fought with something just as powerful. An unbreakable belief in each other, in their training, and in their mission. There's a chilling story from Iwo Jima that captures this perfectly. A group of Japanese defenders had spent days ambushing Marines from hidden tunnels. One night, Instead of surrendering, they launched a desperate charge. The Marines met them head-on, point-blank combat, knives, grenades, bare hands. When the smoke cleared, both sides were nearly wiped out. One wounded Japanese officer, captured later, said, "The Marines are not men, they are iron." That quote spread quickly through surviving units, a grim legend that defined the rest of the war. The Japanese didn't just fear Marine firepower, they feared Marine endurance. The idea that no matter how many you killed, more would come. That no matter how strong your defenses, they'd find a way in. By 1944, the Japanese High Command had identified the U.S. Marines as light invaders. Facing them meant almost certain death. In private communications, Japanese officers sometimes begged for reinforcements, saying, "We are fighting the Marines, the devils in green." But the real question remains, how did this rivalry, this hatred, evolve into something so deeply psychological? Why did it burn so intensely that even decades later, veterans on both sides spoke of it with a mix of horror and respect? To answer that, we need to go deeper, into the mindset, propaganda, and psychological warfare that shaped both armies. Because hatred in war doesn't come from the battlefield alone. It's born from belief, from what men are taught to think before they ever pull a trigger. Before the first Marine ever landed on a Pacific island, Japan had already begun shaping its soldiers' minds. From childhood, Japanese boys were told that they were born to serve the emperor, not as individuals, but as instruments of divine will. Schoolbooks glorified sacrifice. Films and posters showed Japanese soldiers charging fearlessly into enemy fire, dying with smiles on their faces. The message was simple: death in service is honor, surrender is disgrace. So, when Japan went to war, its soldiers believed they were unbeatable. They had crushed the Chinese, humiliated European colonial forces, and in 1941, destroyed the pride of America. The Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. For a time, the myth of invincibility seemed real. But myths always meet reality eventually, and that reality arrived wearing olive drab and carrying M1 Garands. The Marines were unlike any opponent Japan had faced. They weren't aristocratic officers or colonial garrisons. They were working-class kids from the farms of Iowa, the factories of Detroit, and the streets of New York. They didn't fight for an emperor. They fought for each other, for survival. That difference in purpose changed everything. Japanese troops were taught that Americans were weak, lazy, even cowardly. But on Guadalcanal, the Japanese learned the hard way that propaganda lies. When the first Japanese counterattack hit Marine lines in August 1942, they expected the Americans to panic. Instead, the Marines dug in and returned fire with a precision that stunned their enemy. Machine guns mowed down wave after wave of attackers. Those who made it close were met with bayonets of shotguns. After hours of slaughter, only silence remained, and the Marines were still there. Captured diaries revealed disbelief. One Japanese soldier wrote, "The Americans fight like madmen. They never rest. They are not afraid to die." That statement flipped the entire Japanese worldview. The Marines had become everything the Japanese claimed to be: fearless, disciplined, and relentless. But it wasn't just courage. The Marines mastered the brutal science of amphibious warfare. No other force on Earth could coordinate sea, air, and land the way they did. From the moment a Marine division hit the beach, chaos turned to precision. Naval bombardment softened targets, engineers cleared obstacles, and platoons moved forward in perfect rhythm. To the Japanese watching from their bunkers, it looked mechanical, inhuman almost. The Japanese defenders lived underground, hiding in caves, enduring endless shelling. They knew that once the Marines landed, the clock began ticking toward their death. There was no escape. The Marines came slowly, systematically, with flamethrowers, grenades, and bulldozers that buried entire positions alive. To the Japanese, it felt like fighting an unstoppable force of nature. By 1943, hatred had replaced arrogance. Japanese troops began calling the Marines the American Ona, demons of war. It wasn't meant as an insult, it was fear dressed as contempt. To hate someone is easier than to admit you're terrified of them. The hatred grew deeper on Tarawa, an island barely 2 miles wide. The Japanese had fortified it for years, promising that 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. 76 hours of pure hell, but they won. The Japanese defenders were annihilated almost to the last man. Those who survived told stories that spread through the Imperial Army like wildfire. They said the Marines charged through open water under machine gunfire, stepping over the bodies of their own comrades, never stopping. They said the Marines fought even when wounded, even when their rifles jammed, even when surrounded. One survivor wrote home, "They do not fear death, they are death." By the time of Saipan in 1944, the Japanese soldiers had no illusions left. They knew what was coming. But hatred has its own momentum. The Japanese command urged them to die with honor rather than surrender to Marines, warning that capture meant torture or humiliation. Civilians on Saipan were told the same lies, that the Marines were monsters who would kill them all. What followed was one of the darkest chapters of the Pacific War. As Marines advanced, thousands of Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs, clutching their children, believing they were escaping worse horrors. The Marines watched in shock, screaming for them to stop. It was the ultimate tragedy of propaganda, hatred so deep it destroyed its own people. But the Japanese hatred of the Marines wasn't just emotional, it was tactical. By late 1944, every Japanese officer knew that if the Marines were landing, the battle was already lost. Army units sometimes fought Americans and survived to withdraw, but Marine operations didn't leave survivors. The Marines didn't occupy, they eradicated. Their doctrine was total: capture the island, secure it, move on. No mercy, no retreat, no hesitation. That approach terrified the Japanese. Their training had taught them that intimidation wins wars, that an enemy's fear breaks him before the fight begins. But how do you break an enemy who seems to have no fear? Marines turned that psychological weapon back against them. They advanced under banners of revenge, for Pearl Harbor, for Bataan, for every friend lost in the jungle, and their battle cry carried across the Pacific: once a Marine, always a Marine. Even Japanese generals took note. At Iwo Jima, General Kuribayashi, one of Japan's most brilliant commanders, warned his men, "The enemy we face is not ordinary. They are Marines, expect no weakness." He forbade suicidal banzai charges, knowing they were useless against such disciplined killers. Instead, he ordered a defense that would force the Marines to bleed for every inch. And bleed they did. 7,000 Marines died, 20,000 were wounded. But they won. When the battle ended, only a few hundred Japanese were captured alive out of 21,000. The rest fought to the death. Some hid for days, still firing, still refusing to believe that the Marines had taken the island. One surviving officer later confessed, "We hated them because they took away our honor. They defeated us at our own game." That statement captures the essence of the hate. The Japanese had built their entire identity around martial superiority, the belief that no one could outfight them in courage, endurance, or spirit. But the Marines shattered that illusion completely. It wasn't just a military loss, it was a cultural collapse. And yet, deep beneath that hatred was something else: respect. In the final months of the war, when American and Japanese patrols stumbled upon each other in the ruins of Okinawa, some didn't even shoot right away. Both sides were too exhausted, too broken. Japanese officers sometimes told their men, "If you must die, die facing the Marines. It is an honorable death." The hatred had transformed into reluctant admiration. The Marines had proven themselves as the embodiment of everything the Japanese once believed only they possessed: discipline, loyalty, sacrifice. The mirror image of their own ideals reflected back at them with American faces, and that reflection burned. By the last year of the Pacific War, the relationship between the Japanese Army and the U.S. Marines had evolved into something beyond ordinary combat. It was a collision of two philosophies, two cultures of war that had come to define themselves through the destruction of the other. Each saw the battle not only as a fight for territory, but as a test of who was truly human enough to endure hell and keep moving forward. For the Marines, every new island was another nightmare waiting to be lived through. They had seen what the Japanese were capable of: the fanatical charges, the suicide traps, the booby-trapped corpses, the civilians forced to die alongside soldiers. The Marines learned not to expect surrender. They learned that mercy could get you killed. That lesson hardened them into something almost elemental: men who walked through fire and refused to stop. For the Japanese, that transformation was horrifying. They had believed that only their own warriors were capable of fighting with divine determination. But now they were staring into an enemy that mirrored their own spirit, and, in many ways, surpassed it. The Japanese called it Kessen Take, decisive resistance. The Marines simply called it doing their job. When the Marines landed on Okinawa in April 1945, it was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific. The island became a graveyard of civilizations. The Japanese dug into the cliffs and hills, creating a fortress designed to swallow invaders alive. Over 100,000 Japanese troops stood ready, alongside thousands of civilians caught in the middle, and then came the Marines, waves of them, under fire from artillery mortars and machine guns that tore through the beaches. The Japanese defenders thought the slaughter would break their spirit. Instead, it only ignited it. The Marines advanced yard by yard through mud, rain, and fire. They cleared caves with flamethrowers, crawled through barbed wire, and fought hand to hand in the dark. At night, Japanese infiltrators slipped through the lines and found Marines waiting, calm and ready. One Japanese officer wrote in his journal before dying, "The Americans do not sleep. They fight in silence, like ghosts." To him, the Marines had become something unnatural, soldiers who moved through exhaustion and fear as if they were immune. But that immunity came at a cost. Behind the helmets and the steel, the Marines were breaking inside. Many lost friends in seconds, carried the screams of the wounded for life, and lived every moment on the edge of madness. Still, they never stopped. That was the part the Japanese couldn't understand. Their own doctrine glorified death, but the Marines fought for life. They didn't rush to die, they fought to survive. Every inch gained, every hill taken, every fallen comrade carried on a stretcher, it all meant something tangible. They weren't fighting for gods or emperors. They were fighting to go home, and in that difference lay the deepest irony. The Japanese soldiers thought dying proved devotion. The Marines proved devotion by refusing to die, by outlasting everything thrown at them. To the Japanese, that persistence felt like mockery, as if the Americans were dismantling the Bushido Code one bullet at a time. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, many Japanese soldiers were still hiding in the jungles, unable to accept it. Those who had fought the Marines carried a particular kind of scar. Not just defeat, but disillusionment. They had seen men who fought without divine blessing, without fear of shame, yet displayed a kind of strength that Bushido had promised only to them. In the years after the war, surviving Japanese veterans spoke about the Marines with a mixture of loathing and awe. Some said they were animals. Others, reluctantly, called them warriors of the highest order. A Japanese captain interviewed decades later said, "When we faced Marines, we faced the truth. That courage is not Japanese or American. It is human." The U.S. Marines also carried their own complicated emotions. Many had developed a hatred of their enemy that was hard to let go. The atrocities, the suicides, the endless ambushes, all of it left scars that no victory could erase. Yet even among those who had lost everything, respect grew. Because on those islands, both sides had seen what the other was willing to endure. There's a story told by a Marine veteran of Okinawa. After a fierce fight near Shuri Ridge, he found a wounded Japanese soldier lying among the rocks, clutching a family photo. The Marine gave him water. The soldier looked up, whispered something in Japanese, and died. Later, an interpreter said the man's last words were, "So this is the American Marine." That single line summed up the paradox. Hatred burned through the war, but it couldn't destroy the recognition of shared humanity. In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt itself into a peaceful nation, and the United States turned the Marines into a symbol of strength and discipline. But the memory of those battles, Iwo Jima, Saipan, Tarawa, Okinawa, never faded. They became part of both countries' DNA. Japanese war memorials still describe the Marines as the most formidable enemy, and in Marine history, the Pacific War remains the ultimate test of the Corps spirit. Even Hollywood couldn't exaggerate it. Movies like Flags of Our Fathers and the Pacific captured glimpses of that reality. The mud, the terror, the brotherhood. Yet no film can truly explain what it was like to face an enemy who would rather die than yield, or to look into the eyes of a man charging at you with a bayonet, screaming, "Banzai," and know that you have no choice but to shoot. That was the Pacific War. That was the bond of hatred and respect forged in the furnace of survival. And when you strip away the politics, the flags, and the propaganda, what remains is something profoundly human. The understanding that even enemies can recognize greatness in each other. The Japanese hated fighting the American Marines because the Marines exposed the limits of their own myths. They proved that honor doesn't belong to any single nation, that endurance is not the property of an empire, and that courage isn't defined by dying, but by refusing to quit. There's a famous quote often attributed to a Japanese officer after the war. "We had been told the Americans were weak, but the Marines, they were like steel. No matter how many we killed, more came. They were not human, they were made of iron." That single statement captures everything. The hatred wasn't born from contempt, it was born from recognition. The Japanese hated the Marines because they saw in them the same unbreakable will they believed only Japan possessed. And realizing that truth, in the mud, the blood, and the fire of the Pacific, was more painful than death itself. When the war ended, many Marines returned home and never spoke of what they saw. But those who did often mentioned one thing, their respect for the Japanese soldier. They knew how fierce he was, how disciplined, how dedicated. And they also knew that, without such an enemy, the legend of the U.S. Marine Corps might never have been forged in the same way. Because legends are born from the enemies that test them. And in the crucible of the Pacific, the Japanese tested the Marines more than anyone else ever could. So when you hear veterans speak with that strange tone, half pride, half sorrow, when they mention Iwo Jima or Okinawa, remember what they're really saying. They're remembering a time when two nations' ideals met in the darkest place on Earth, and neither flinched. They're remembering a war where hate and respect shared the same breath. That's why Japanese soldiers hated fighting American Marines more than any other unit. Because in them, they saw their own reflection.